Well, good evening. So good to see you. How is it with your soul tonight? Okay, it is well with your soul? Okay, we're going to sing that later on. Hey, welcome. So glad you're here. Thank you for those that are joining us online. Thank you for being a part of this. We're together in this. And so tonight we are going to be talking about how to trust God through the storms of life. You know, here in Central Florida, we experience hurricanes, right? A year ago, we went through Ian, and, you know, there are some people still recovering from that horrible storm. And so in Florida, if you've been here long enough, you know, it's not a matter of if, but when, right? Sooner or later, a storm is going to come. You know, it's like life too, right? It's not a matter of if, but it's a matter of when we will go through different kinds of storms in this lifetime. For example, sometimes we go through relational storms, right? Relational storms when there's a lot of stress. Maybe it's a troubled marriage, or someone you love is just ripping your heart out. Or maybe it's a friend or coworker that you're at odds with, and you're in this relational storm. Keeps you up at night. Or maybe it's a financial storm. You know, the cost of living is going up, and for many people, their income is not going up with that, and they feel this rising tide, and it brings a lot of fear and anxiety to people. Maybe maybe you're swimming in a sea of debt, and you wonder, how will I ever get out from underneath this? Or maybe you're in those retirement ages, and you're not sure that your money is going to hold out, and you might have more life than you have money. And you're beginning to worry about that, and it's causing a storm. Or possibly an emotional storm. Maybe you've been hit with some severe sense of anxiety or depression. There are some saying that we are now, since COVID, in an anxiety pandemic. And I think that's very true. I know from where I sit on a daily basis, I see that. Maybe emotionally, you're here tonight and you're grieving. You are just grieving the loss of someone that you loved, and you're feeling like, when will this pain, when will this storm ever stop? Maybe you are in physical pain. You have some health issues, chronic pain, or maybe you've got word from a doctor, you've had some tests done, and you know there's some real concerns, and you're now struggling with your own physical health, and it feels like you're in a storm. Or maybe you're in a spiritual storm. Maybe this wave of doubt about God is just kind of overwhelming you. God, are you really there? Or maybe you're struggling with some stubborn sin that you just can't seem to get victory over. Or maybe it's something in your past that the enemy just keeps throwing in your face constantly, and you're in that storm. Well, the question we want to look at tonight is, how do you trust God in these storms? To get you through these storms in a way we actually grow spiritually. That's what we're going to look at. So we're going to actually look at a storm tonight in the 27th chapter of the book of Acts. It's the story of the Apostle Paul, who's on a voyage, a dangerous voyage that ends up in a shipwreck. So this is a very stormy, literally stormy message, and I'm a little hesitant to bring it because my wife is afraid to go on a cruise, and after tonight, it's never going to happen, I'm sure. Right, hon? After I describe this storm. But that's what we're going to look at tonight from the 27th chapter of the book of Acts. Luke is with Paul in this voyage, so being the doctor that he is, he documents everything, and there's some real specific things that we'll look at in this storm. But let me give us a little bit of background first to how this all came about. So the Apostle Paul, he is arrested in Jerusalem, right? Because he's preaching the good news. The religious leaders don't like that. They literally want him dead. Kind of like Jesus, right? They wanted him dead, but they didn't have the authority to do that. The Romans didn't like all the ruckus that it was causing, so they take Paul and they get him over to the coast to Caesarea. So in Caesarea, while they're waiting for a ship, he pleads his case to Felix, the governor. Felix goes, nothing wrong with this guy. What's the charges? And then even King Agrippa, who's very curious in the case, him and his wife come to hear the charges that are brought. And Paul tells his story. And even King Agrippa goes, my goodness, you're almost convincing me to become a Christian. So Paul is having this opportunity, but he's waiting because he's made an appeal to Caesar. Now, where was Caesar? Caesar's in Italy. That's a long way from Caesarea. And that was going to require a boat ride. So Luke documents all of this. And Julius, who is in charge of the Apostle Paul, a Roman soldier, to make sure he gets to Italy safely, I think he kind of likes Paul. And in fact, on their way to Italy, they go through several ports. And in those ports, Julius gave him the freedom to go off the ship and have some of his friends come to be with him. And so things are kind of sailing pretty smooth so far. Things are going okay. But from this point, things get a little crazy. And we'll pick up the story there because they're at this port, and the next step in the journey is to board a ship that will take them directly to Italy. Follow me so far? Okay. So there's something in that part of the world called the autumn equinox. And what that is, it's a time of the year when there was an equal time of daylight and an equal time of night. And that was the window of time where it was the safest to sail on the ocean. Guess what? That window was closed. It was not in that season. And any attempt to voyage out or to sail was very, very dangerous. Paul, not being a meteorologist or anything, at least he knew enough. Pick up the story here. Since much time had passed and the voyage was now dangerous, because even the fast was already over, Paul advised them, saying, "Sirs, I perceive that the voyage will be with injury and much loss, not only the cargo and the ship, but also our lives." But the centurion paid more attention to the pilot and to the owner of the ship than what Paul said. And because of the harbor was not suitable to spend the winter in, the majority decided to put out to sea from there on the chance that somehow they could reach Phoenix, the harbor of Crete, facing both the southwest and the northwest, spent the winter there. So here's the deal. Paul's saying, guys, bad time to sail. You should know better, right? You are sailors. But for whatever reason, they decide, we're gonna just take our chances, right? We're just gonna take our chances. First point I want to make is this. Some of the storms in life are the result of other people's bad choices. Isn't that true? You might be in a storm. It's not a storm that you created, but it's the result of someone else's bad choices that now, because you're close to the situation, you find yourself in that storm. Example? A married couple, someone discovers that their spouse has been unfaithful. Oh my gosh, you talk about a tidal wave of betrayal and pain and questions because of a choice that someone else made. And now they're in this storm of bitterness. Or take, for example, some of you in this room were probably abused when you were just very little. And you still live with the memories and the trauma. You were just a kid. It was somebody else's bad choices that created havoc for you in your life. Or maybe you have a child or a grandchild that they're really gone off the deep end. And because you love them, you stay up at night wondering and worrying how they're doing. Or how about this? You're going home from work, just minding your own business, paying attention to the road, and someone who may be abusing alcohol or drugs or texting goes through a stop sign and hits you broadside, and you end up in the hospital. Not because you were not paying attention, but because somebody else made a bad decision, and now you're you get what I'm saying here, right? In fact, there's a biblical story of Jonah. You remember Jonah, God says, I want you to go to Nineveh to talk to these people. He says, ain't doing it. I don't like those people. So he goes the opposite direction, right? Gets in a ship, goes out to sea, and this huge storm comes, and, everybody's freaking out on the ship. And like, what? Who upset the gods that Jonah finally fessed up? Is me. My bad. Of course, we'll get back to Jonah's story, but other people were in the middle of a storm because his bad choice. So they make the decision anyway. We're going. And sure enough, things were okay at first. But let me pick up on the story in verse 13. Now when the south wind blew gently, supposing that they had obtained their purpose, they weighed anchor and sailed along Crete, close to the shore. But soon a tempestuous wind called the northeaster struck down from the land, and when the ship was caught and could not face the wind, we gave way to it and were driven along. Okay, so we have some boaters out there. My son-in-law's here. He's a boater. He knows about these things. I can tell you a quick story about my getting caught in a storm. Just got this new boat, 17-foot boat. My wife talked me into getting, which was amazing. And so it was new, and I was excited, and I was by myself, and I was thinking, you know what? It's a calm day. I'm going to go out Port Canaveral. It was like a sheet of glass. And I'm just, I'm enjoying this. So I go to one buoy, and then I go to the next buoy, and, I'm at like 5 miles in a 17-foot boat. But it's glass. It's calm. So I take a look at the shore, and I realize it's very dark over there. And all of a sudden, I feel this breeze, kind of like, better turn around right now. Within moments, I was in 3 to 5 foot seas. Breaking over the top of my bow, I am standing in ankle-deep water. It is raining so hard. I don't have any equipment on the boat. I don't even know which direction I'm going, whether I'm end up in Bahamas, right? And so I'm scared to death. I'm thinking, oh, Lord, save me, right? Finally, I saw the back end of a cruise ship and followed it and got into port. But that's a scary thing. And so they are literally in the midst of a perfect storm. And so sometimes we feel like we're completely out of control in the storms of life. When you try everything, but nothing's working. Nothing's calming the seas. Nothing you try seems to make things better. Maybe the storm that you've been in is a storm fighting cancer, right? You've been to the doctor, you've been on several treatments, and nothing seems to be working, and you feel very much out of control. Maybe the marriage is on the rocks, right? You've tried everything, you've been to counseling, and it just feels like, gosh, it doesn't seem to be much hope. And they try their very best to try to keep things under control. Now look in verse 16. Running under the lee of a small island called Cauda, they managed with difficulty to secure the ship's boat. After hoisting it up, they used supports and undergird the ship. Then, fearing that they would run aground on Citrus, they lowered the gear and thus were driven along. Since we were violently storm-tossed, they began the next day to jettison the cargo. And on the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. But when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope of being saved was at last abandoned. Wow. They tried everything, throwing stuff off the boat. They tried anchoring it to keep it still. Nothing. They were just, if you've been in a boat and you're in a storm and you're not going into the waves and you got sideways, guess what? You are out of control now. That storm controls everything. And that's a scary place to be. Some of you know what that feels like when you tried everything you possibly can to get some sense of control. Just finished reading a book by Curtis Chang called The Anxiety Opportunity, which anxiety is an opportunity? Well, it's a really good book, but he says that we are now living in an age of anxiety, an anxiety pandemic. And ever since COVID, that really is true. He writes this and says, in recent years, all kinds of terms emerged in the national discourse. Terms like racial anxiety, climate change anxiety, election anxiety. In the era of smartphones, dooms scrolling entered the vocabulary to describe how we can be addicted to consuming information that makes us feel more worried. Doom scrolling, that's a new word. Just more bad news, more bad news. Well, that's not helpful, is it? He said, right now we have a leading mental health problem around the world. But what Chang would go on to say is that anxiety, which is really the fear of loss, can be an opportunity for spiritual growth. During COVID, I posted something on our refrigerator. It's a saying. It was written by a dear lady who's now in heaven. She was in her 90s when I met her, Betty Skinner. And here's what she said. In fact, this is still on my refrigerator. Your choice is this: to hold on to your illusions of control by fighting the reality you find yourself in, or to trust God's goodness and desire to move you to a new place of freedom. Let that sink in for just a second. The things you fear the most could be the very things that's going to move you into a deeper relationship with God, but the choice is truly ours. What are we going to do in the midst of those storms? So here's Paul. He's in the boat. Everybody's freaking out. They have now lost hope. We're going to die. We're never going to see our families again, right? So here Paul speaks up. Verse 21. Since they had been without food for a long time, Paul stood up among them and said, men, you should have listened to me. I told you so, guys. I told you not to sail. You should have listened to me and not have set sail for Crete and incurred this injury and loss. Yet now, hey, we're in this situation. I now urge you to take heart, for there will be no more loss of life among you, but only the ship. For this very night there stood before me an angel of God to whom I belong and to whom I worship. And he said, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar, and behold, God has granted you all those who sail with you. So take heart, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have told you. But we must run aground on the island. See, Paul, this isn't his first rodeo. This is not his first storm. He had been through an awful lot of stormy weather. And here's what he says in 1 Corinthians. For we do not want you to be unaware, brothers, of the afflictions we experienced in Asia. We were so utterly burdened beyond our strength that we despaired of life itself. Indeed, we felt we had received the sentence of death, but that was to make us rely not on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. So, yeah, amen. So Paul, he had experience. He'd been through a lot of storms, and God got him through those storms. So now he is saying, guys, we're going to make it. We're going to make it. It's going to be rough. It's going to be rough, but we're going to make it. Now, that leads me to this point. Some storms require someone else that is well-grounded in the faith to encourage us. When you're in the middle of a storm, and you're still struggling, you need somebody else to come and say, you're going to make it. Tell you this story. About 5 years ago, I think it was about 5 years ago, I was in a storm. I was in the worst emotional storm I had ever been in my entire life. And I'll spare you the details, but it was a perfect storm. Several things were all coming together to literally put me in a storm that created the highest level of anxiety and depression that I've ever experienced in my life. And I mean, it was bad. I remember being in my office over in the rink one day with high blood pressure, and I thought I was having a heart attack. I walked out in the hall, and I grabbed my colleague and said, you need to take me to the hospital right now. I think I'm having a heart attack. Well, it wasn't a heart attack. Guess what it was? It was a panic attack. And I was in a bad way. And so, I'm trying to make it through, and it was pretty clear that I was really, really in trouble. So thankfully, I have a wonderful family that came alongside of me and supported me and carried me. I have a sister down in South Florida who took me in. I took a leave of absence here at Northland. She took me in, and she made sure I was putting on my sneakers and walking and feeding me. But one of my grandsons, Parker John, very sensitive boy. He picks things up, Something's wrong with Pa. Something's wrong with Pa. So what he did is because I used to draw pictures for the kids, So he got his little sister and his big brother to draw a picture for Pa. And so they draw this picture. And you know the story of Finding Nemo? You know that story? Nemo is swimming, and he's pretty much lost hope that he's ever going to find his way back home. Remember that? And then there's little Dory, right? Parker John and those kids drew that picture for me. And I put that picture in the bathroom every morning when I woke up. That saved my life. It saved my life. There was somebody else outside the storm that was able to speak, able to use words. Just keep swimming. Just keep swimming. Whew. That was a hard story to tell. I still have that picture. It's right in my office. I will never, ever get rid of that picture. Sometimes, though, when we're in the storm and we're losing control, we want to find some way to get control, right? So that's what they were doing on the ship. I'm going to start reading in verse 27. When the 14th night had come, as we were being driven across the Adriatic Sea, about midnight the sailors suspected that they were nearing land. So they took sounding and found 20 fathoms. A little farther on, they took sounding again and found 15 fathoms. And fearing that we might run on the rocks, they let down 4 anchors. By the way, some archaeologists figured out about where they were and the measurements here of the depth of the water. They found 4 Roman anchors. Just so you know, the Bible's pretty darn accurate when it comes to its details. And as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship and had lowered the ship's boat into the sea under the pretense of laying out the anchors from the bow, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved." Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the ship and let it go. So here's what's happening. The sailors, they think, this is not going to end well. So they're putting down the anchors, making it look like that's what they're doing. But what they're really doing secretly is they're lowering the lifeboats. They are getting out of here. We're not going to deal with this. We're going to take our chances. We're going to gain some control of the situation. And so we are going to lower the lifeboats. Paul says, don't do that. Don't do that. Don't lower the lifeboat. Because if you lower the lifeboat, you're not going to be saved. How many times when we're in the midst of a storm and we're feeling out of control, do we lower lifeboats? We lower lifeboats. We want some sense of control. And this is where, if you will, our addictions come to play, right? Hey, let's admit it. We all have some addictions. It's some attachment. Some place we go, something we do, something we take that somehow transports us from the reality of the situation we're in. It's kind of like a personal Disney World that we escape into to gain some sense of control. All our addictions are about two things, relief and control. But do they really work? No, not so much. So many times we lower the lifeboat. You know, Jonah, back to Jonah, he's in the middle of a storm, right? He gets thrown overboard, he gets swallowed by a fish, and he's praying his socks off, right? He's praying. Middle of a prayer, he says something for our sake that is incredibly wise and important for us to take note of. Here's what Jonah said. Oh, this is the point we're making. Some storms tempt us to take matters into our own hands rather than trust our life into God's hands. So here's what Jonah says. Those who cling to vain idols. Now, vain idols is lowering our boats, lowering the lifeboats. I will make life work. I can't trust God in the midst of this. I will make something work. I will feel better now, right? Leave behind the gracious love that could have been theirs. Or one translation says, those that worship foreign idols forfeit the grace that could be theirs had they stayed in the boat. The Message says, those who worship hollow gods, God frauds, walk away from their only true love. How many times do we lower the lifeboat if we would just stay in the boat and experience, and we're going to get to how that grace comes that they would have forfeited had they lowered the lifeboats and got on them. So, waiting on the Lord, our next point, waiting on the Lord in a storm opens opportunities to experience God's sustaining grace. So they cut loose the anchors and they're heading for the beach. The boat crashes, it breaks up into pieces, the ship is broken up, and all 276 people swim to shore. They make it. So now, what happens? 28 verse 1. After we were brought safely through, we then learned that the island was called Malta, and the native people showed us unusual kindness. I want you to note that word. Unusual kindness. For they kindled a fire and welcomed us all because it had begun to rain and it was cold. Now picture this. You're one of those 276 passengers. You've been out at sea in the middle of a Category 5 hurricane. It's dark. You can't even navigate with the stars. You have no idea where you are. And you're terrified of the ship just crashing and you drowning. And so the ship runs ashore. They make it to shore. And can you imagine how good it must have felt to step on dry land? But not only that, the locals come. They bring blankets. They start a fire. They start feeding them. It's called unusual kindness. Better way of saying, that's called grace. That's called grace. Unusual kindness. How many times we forfeit that unusual kindness because we gotta take matters into our own hands, right? Here's what my friend Gerald May says in his book, Addiction and Grace. Great book, by the way. How often, of course, do we not sense the constancy of grace-giving love? In many situations, God may seem unloving or even completely absent. Sometimes this is because we are blinded by our attachments. We're so preoccupied, our attention is so kidnapped by our compulsions that we tune out the background of God's love. Wow. You know, the Apostle Paul, he went through a lot of hard stuff, difficult stuff. And he learned something over time, that if he would stay in the boat, God would provide unusual kindness. Here's what he says. Here's what Paul says. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this. That's this thorn. He had this thorn. We don't know what it was. Could have been some physical issues. We don't know for sure. But it was a storm that continually bothered him. He was continually in this storm. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord, take me out of this storm, that it should leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Sometimes God doesn't take us out of the storm, but God does provide us grace, his divine enablement to endure the storm. Make sense? And so whatever storm you're going into right now, there's a temptation. Yes, I definitely want to lower that lifeboat, but staying in the boat and waiting upon the Lord. They that wait upon the Lord, what? Shall renew their strength. They shall fly like on wings of eagles. They shall walk and not be weary. They shall run and not faint. But there's the waiting part, right? We're not good at waiting. And yet, here's the truth of the matter. We're all in the same boat together. And it's a stormy life. But guess what? The time will come when our feet are going to hit the celestial shores. And there will be no more storms. There'll be no more sickness, no more heartache, no more pain, no more division, no more tears. And God is going to make all things new. And we will enter into unusual kindness forever. That is the joy that is set before us, right? And that's what sustained Jesus, right? He wanted to lower the lifeboat at one time. Lord, let this cup pass. But he stayed in the boat. He stayed in the boat for us so that we could have unusual kindness. The last point I want to make here, God has a purpose for our storms. Did you know that? Usually the storms we go through have a purpose and ultimately is going to benefit someone else. So this last point I want to make, trusting God through the storms of life provides us opportunities to further the mission of God to redeem a people from all peoples by engaging neighbors and nations to be fully alive in King Jesus through the power of the Holy Spirit. You recognize that? Yeah, that's our mission statement. Well, this is actually lived out. Having gone through this horrible storm, God's purpose is being carried out. So what happens? So Paul's gathering sticks, and happens to be a poisonous snake, and it bites him. People think, oh no, he's going to die. It's a poisonous snake, he's going to die. Well, he doesn't die. In fact, he lives, and they think, okay, is he some sort of God or something? Paul says, no. No, I serve a God who heals people. And so then, people on the island start bringing people to him. Opportunities are now showing up right to Paul. And other people are getting healed. Word gets out, the chief of that island, Publius, has a sick father. Paul comes to visit this Publius and his father gets healed. Oh my goodness. So what is happening here? A shipwreck with a purpose to reach people who have never been reached otherwise. They went through the storm and God's bigger purpose, and that's true of the storms we're in. I can tell you this, the storm that I went through, when I sit with people suffering from anxiety and depression, boy, oh boy, I know what that feels like. And I feel I have an opportunity to say, just keep swimming. Just keep swimming. You're going to make it through the storm. And that's the truth of the matter, folks. We are all going to make it. We're going to make it through this storm. Every single one of us who've trusted Jesus will make it through the storm. So, as we wrap things up here and go into our time of communion, maybe you're not in a storm. Maybe things are calm. Praise the Lord. That's wonderful. But, it's probably not if, but when you will face a storm. So remember this story. Number one, stay in the boat. Don't lower the lifeboat. Stay with it. Just keep swimming. Just keep swimming. And wait for God to show you unusual kindness. He will give you the grace that you need, both now and later on. They had breakfast on the beach. That was a beautiful thing. But folks, when we reach heaven's shores, we're going to the marriage supper of the Lamb. It's going to be amazing. You talk about unusual kindness. I don't think we can even get our heads around how wonderful that's going to be. Why is that important? Because that's what helps us endure the storms. Remember what Josh has been teaching us? Jesus, when he faced the cross, he endured the cross because of the joy that was before him. We know how this story ends. We know that the storms will be calm again. And that's what helps us to just keep swimming. So just keep swimming, folks. Just keep swimming.